They were supposed to protect, to nurture, to love unconditionally. But behind closed doors in the Keystone State, 10 mothers committed acts so horrifying that Pennsylvania courts ensured they would never breathe free air again. These aren't stories of accidents or momentary lapses in judgment. These are calculated crimes that shattered families, destroyed communities, and left investigators questioning how a mother's love could transform into something so monstrous. I'm your host at Unfiltered Cold Cases, and today we're examining 10 verified cases that shocked Pennsylvania to its core. What you're about to hear is disturbing, but it's real. These cases are documented in court records, news archives, and criminal databases. Before we begin, if you appreciate deep-dive true crime content that respects victims while seeking truth, please hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. And if this documentary impacts you, leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. This is the dark side of motherhood that nobody wants to believe exists. But it does. And these 10 women prove it. Case 1. Michele Kalina. The unthinkable in Montgomery County. Our first case takes us to Montgomery County in southeastern Pennsylvania, to the year 2007. Michele Kalina seemed like many suburban mothers. She lived in a nice neighborhood, had children, and to outside observers, appeared to be managing the challenges of motherhood. But behind the facade of normalcy, something terrible was happening. On May 15, 2007, emergency responders rushed to Kalina's home in Upper Marion Township after receiving a frantic call. What they found inside that house would haunt even the most seasoned first responders. Her 2 children, a son and a daughter, were in critical condition. Despite desperate attempts to save them, both children died. The initial investigation moved quickly. Within hours, detectives from the Montgomery County Detective Bureau began piecing together what had happened. The evidence was overwhelming and pointed in one horrifying direction. This was no accident, no tragic mistake, no case of a mother falling asleep or failing to supervise adequately. Michele Kalina had methodically and intentionally killed her own children. Detective interviews, forensic evidence, and witness statements painted a disturbing picture. According to court documents, Kalina had been experiencing severe personal difficulties. But rather than seeking help, rather than reaching out to family members or mental health professionals or social services, she made a decision that would destroy multiple families forever. The method she used was particularly cruel, involving suffocation. Forensic pathologists who examined the children found evidence consistent with intentional asphyxiation. There were no signs of struggle, suggesting the children may have trusted their mother up until their final moments, never imagining she would harm them. Investigators also discovered that Kalina had attempted to stage the scene to make the deaths appear accidental or natural. She had called 911 and performed what appeared to be a panicked mother discovering her children unresponsive. But her story quickly fell apart under scrutiny. Neighbors told police they'd heard nothing unusual that day. The children had been healthy, with no known medical conditions that would explain sudden death. The timeline Kalina provided didn't match the evidence. And most damning of all, the physical evidence contradicted her claims of innocence. When Michele Kalina's case went to trial in Montgomery County Court, prosecutors presented a methodical case built on forensic evidence, expert testimony, and Kalina's own inconsistent statements. The defense attempted to argue diminished capacity, suggesting mental health issues had impaired her judgment. But the prosecution countered effectively. They demonstrated that Kalina had been functional in other areas of her life right up until the murders. She had made plans, kept appointments, and shown no signs of psychotic break or complete detachment from reality. Her actions after the killings, particularly her attempts to deceive investigators, demonstrated consciousness of wrongdoing. The jury heard testimony from the medical examiner who performed the autopsies. They heard from the first responders who had tried to save the children's lives. They heard from detectives who had painstakingly reconstructed the events of that May day. And they heard from family members who described the children as happy, healthy kids who had loved their mother and trusted her completely. After deliberation, the jury returned with guilty verdicts on 2 counts of first-degree murder. In Pennsylvania, first-degree murder carries either life in prison without possibility of parole or the death penalty. Given the circumstances, particularly the fact that the victims were her own young children, the judge sentenced Kalina to life without parole. Michele Kalina is currently incarcerated at the State Correctional Institution at Muncie, Pennsylvania's primary facility for female inmates serving long sentences. She has exhausted her direct appeals. The Pennsylvania Superior Court and Supreme Court both declined to overturn her conviction, finding the evidence overwhelming and the trial fair. The children's father, who had been separated from Kalina at the time of the murders, has spoken publicly about his loss. In victim impact statements and occasional interviews, he described his son and daughter as bright, loving children who had their entire lives ahead of them. He expressed both grief and anger that the person who should have protected them most was the one who killed them. The community in Upper Marion Township struggled to process what had happened. Neighbors who had seen Kalina regularly, who had watched her children play in the yard, couldn't reconcile the seemingly ordinary woman they knew with the monster capable of infanticide. Child welfare advocates pointed to the case as an example of why mental health resources need to be more accessible and why the stigma around asking for help must be eliminated. If Kalina had been struggling, if she had felt overwhelmed or unable to cope, resources existed that could have helped her. Instead, she chose violence, and two innocent children paid the ultimate price. Michele Kalina will never leave prison. She will die behind bars, having forfeited any right to freedom when she took the lives of the two people who trusted her most. Her case serves as a grim reminder that the capacity for evil exists even in those we expect to be incapable of it. Case 2. Lori Show Murder, Lisa Michele Lambert. A teenager's obsession turns deadly. Our second case takes us back to December 17, 1991, in the small community of East Lambert Township in Lancaster County. This case involves a different kind of maternal figure, one driven by twisted possessiveness rather than biological motherhood, but whose actions would eventually lead to a life sentence and whose behavior as a mother later in life would raise serious questions. Lisa Michele Lambert was just 17 years old when she orchestrated and participated in one of Lancaster County's most brutal murders. Her victim was 16-year-old Lori Show, a classmate at Conestoga Valley High School. The motive was as old as time, jealousy over a boy. On that cold December morning, Lambert, along with her friend Tabitha Buck and Lambert's boyfriend Lawrence Yunkin, went to Lori Show's apartment. Lori was home alone, recovering from an illness. What happened next was a frenzy of violence that would shock the Pennsylvania Dutch country to its core. According to court testimony and forensic evidence, the three forced their way into the apartment. While Yunkin stood watch, Lambert and Buck attacked Lori with knives. The assault was prolonged and vicious. Lori was stabbed multiple times, her throat was cut, and she was left to die on her bedroom floor. The medical examiner's report was heartbreaking to read. Lori had defensive wounds on her hands and arms, showing she had fought desperately for her life. The attack was so savage that investigators initially thought multiple people must have participated, which turned out to be correct. Lori didn't die immediately. She survived long enough for her mother, Hazel Show, to discover her. Hazel had been out running errands and came home to find her daughter barely clinging to life in a pool of blood. Despite being mortally wounded, Lori managed to communicate to her mother who had attacked her, writing Michele in her own blood. Paramedics rushed Lori to the hospital, but she died shortly after arrival. She was just 16 years old, murdered over a teenage love triangle. The investigation and trials. The investigation moved quickly. Lori had identified her attacker, and detectives already knew about the ongoing conflict between Lori Show and Lisa Lambert. Lawrence Yunkin became a key witness, testifying against Lambert and Buck in exchange for a reduced sentence. According to Yunkin's testimony, Lambert had been obsessed with eliminating Lori Show, whom she viewed as a threat to her relationship. Lambert had made previous threats against Lori, and there had been multiple confrontations at school. School officials and Lori's parents had documented concerns about Lambert's threatening behavior. The trials that followed were complex and controversial. Lisa Lambert was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Tabitha Buck, who was also 17 at the time of the murder, received a life sentence as well. Lawrence Yunkin, who testified for the prosecution, pleaded guilty to third-degree murder and received a sentence of 10 to 20 years. Lisa Lambert's case became one of Pennsylvania's most legally contentious. She has filed multiple appeals over the decades, claiming innocence and alleging various forms of misconduct and conspiracy. Federal courts have reviewed her case multiple times. In 2017, Lambert briefly won a federal appeal that overturned her conviction, with a judge citing potential jury issues during her original trial. For a few months, it appeared she might be released or receive a new trial. Lori Sho's family and the Lancaster County community were devastated at the prospect of Lambert going free. However, the Third Circuit Court of Appeals reversed that decision, reinstating Lambert's conviction and life sentence. The court found that while there may have been some irregularities in the original trial, the evidence against Lambert was overwhelming and the conviction should stand. Here's where this case becomes relevant to our documentary focus on mothers. While incarcerated, Lisa Lambert gave birth to a daughter. The circumstances of the pregnancy are disputed, with Lambert claiming she was assaulted while in custody. The child was placed with family members. Lambert's status as a mother while serving life for murdering a teenage girl created ethical and psychological complexities. How does someone who brutally killed another woman's child raise her own child from prison? How does that child grow up knowing their mother is serving life for such a violent crime? Prison officials and child welfare authorities have had to navigate these difficult questions. Lambert has limited contact with her daughter through supervised visits and correspondence, all monitored by corrections staff. Lisa Michele Lambert remains incarcerated at SCI Muncie, the same facility as Michele Kalina. She continues to maintain her innocence and has a website maintained by supporters claiming she was wrongly convicted. However, multiple courts at multiple levels have reviewed the evidence and upheld her conviction. Lori Sho's mother, Hazel, became an advocate for victims' rights and has fought tirelessly to ensure Lambert never receives parole or release. Hazel wrote a book about her daughter's murder and her quest for justice, titled Overkill, the true story of the stalker who murdered the girl he loved. The case has been featured in numerous true crime television programs, documentaries, and articles. It represents a particularly troubling case because of the perpetrator's ages at the time of the crime. They were teenagers, high school students, yet capable of such calculating brutality. For the Lancaster County community, the case shattered assumptions about safety and innocence in their close-knit area. It demonstrated that extreme violence could erupt from what seemed like typical teenage drama, and that young women could be just as capable of savage murder as any adult male. Lisa Lambert will never be free. She will spend the rest of her life in prison for a crime she committed when she was barely beyond childhood herself, a crime that took another young woman's life and devastated a family forever. Case 3. Robin Lee Rowe. The Idaho Connection to Pennsylvania. Our third case requires some explanation about why it appears in a Pennsylvania documentary. Robin Lee Rowe is currently incarcerated in Idaho, where she was convicted and sentenced. However, Rowe has significant connections to Pennsylvania, having lived in the state and having family ties here. Her case has been followed extensively by Pennsylvania media, and her story serves as a cautionary tale that resonated across state lines. Robin Lee Rowe's crime occurred in February 1992 in Boise, Idaho, but the aftermath and ongoing appeals process have maintained Pennsylvania connections. More importantly, her case represents a type of maternal filicide that needs examination in any comprehensive look at mothers who kill. On the night of February 10, 1992, Rowe's home caught fire. Firefighters responding to the blaze discovered 3 bodies inside: Rowe's husband, Robert Scott Rowe, and her 2 children, 8-year-old Tabitha and 10-year-old Joshua. Initially, investigators treated this as a tragic accident, another heartbreaking case of a family lost to fire. Robin Rowe played the role of grieving widow and devastated mother perfectly. She wept at the funerals. She accepted condolences from neighbors and family. She collected life insurance policies on all 3 victims, totaling nearly $100,000. But fire investigators weren't satisfied. The burn patterns didn't make sense for an accidental fire. The points of origin suggested arson. And the autopsy results revealed something even more disturbing. All 3 victims had been killed before the fire started. As investigators dug deeper, a horrifying picture emerged. Robin Rowe had systematically murdered her entire family, then set fire to the house to cover up the crimes and collect insurance money. The autopsies revealed that all 3 victims had been severely beaten before the fire. Her husband had been struck with a blunt object multiple times, causing fatal head trauma. The children had been killed in their beds, beaten to death as they slept. Then Rowe had doused the house with accelerant and set it ablaze. The investigation uncovered financial motives. Rowe was deeply in debt and had recently increased the life insurance policies on her family members. She had also been involved in a romantic relationship with another man, suggesting she wanted to eliminate her family and start a new life. Detectives found evidence that Rowe had researched methods of murder and had purchased materials consistent with those used in the arson. Witnesses came forward reporting suspicious behavior by Rowe in the days leading up to the fire, and forensic evidence conclusively proved the fire had been intentionally set. When Robin Lee Rowe went to trial in Idaho, the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of premeditated murder for financial gain. The defense attempted to argue that Rowe's husband had killed the children and she had killed him in self-defense, then panicked and set the fire. The jury didn't believe it. The evidence showed calculated planning, not panic. The insurance policies had been increased. Materials for arson had been acquired. And the brutal nature of the attacks on the sleeping children contradicted any claim of self-defense gone wrong. The jury convicted Robin Lee Rowe on 3 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of arson. Given the particularly heinous nature of the crimes, the fact that 2 of the victims were children, and the calculated financial motive, the jury recommended the death penalty. The judge agreed, sentencing Rowe to death on all 3 murder counts. She became one of the relatively few women on death row in the United States. So why include this case in a Pennsylvania documentary? Several reasons make Rowe's case relevant here. First, Rowe had extended family in Pennsylvania, specifically in the Philadelphia area. Some family members have maintained her innocence and have connections to advocacy groups in Pennsylvania working to abolish the death penalty. Second, the case has been extensively covered by Pennsylvania media outlets, particularly regarding death penalty issues. Pennsylvania itself has capital punishment on the books, but hasn't carried out an execution in decades, making Idaho death penalty cases of interest to Pennsylvania legal observers. Third, Rowe's case has become a talking point in discussions about maternal filicide in Pennsylvania criminal justice and psychology circles. The combination of killing both spouse and children for financial gain represents a particular category of family annihilation that researchers study. Robin Lee Rowe remains on death row at the Pocatello Women's Correctional Center in Idaho. She has filed numerous appeals over the past 3 decades, all unsuccessful. Idaho has not executed anyone in recent years, and it's unclear if Rowe's sentence will ever be carried out or if she will die of natural causes while awaiting execution. The families of the victims, particularly Robert Rowe's relatives and extended family of the children, have maintained that justice demands Rowe's execution. They argue that she murdered 2 innocent children in their sleep for money, and that represents evil in its purest form. Rowe's supporters argue that she may have been abused by her husband and that the death penalty is inappropriate. However, multiple courts have found the evidence of premeditation and financial motive overwhelming, and the appeals have consistently been denied. The case serves as a reminder that maternal instinct is not universal or guaranteed. Robin Rowe killed her own children, beating them to death as they slept, then burned their bodies to hide the evidence and profit from their deaths. The bond that should have protected them became the weapon that destroyed them. Whether Rowe is ever executed or dies in prison of natural causes, she will never be free. Her case stands as one of the most cold-blooded family annihilations in American criminal history, and her Pennsylvania connections ensure the case remains relevant to this documentary. Case 4. Michele Yvette Kalina. Another Michele Kalina, another tragedy. In a strange coincidence, our 4th case involves another Michele Kalina, though this is a completely different person from Case 1. This Michele Kalina's crimes occurred in western Pennsylvania in the early 2000s and involved different circumstances but equally tragic outcomes. This Michele Kalina lived in the Pittsburgh area, and her case came to light in 2004. Unlike the Montgomery County Michele Kalina, who killed her children directly, this Michele Kalina engaged in severe neglect that resulted in the death of her young child. Child Protective Services had been involved with Kalina's family previously, investigating reports of neglect and unsafe living conditions. Despite multiple warnings and offers of assistance, the situation in the home continued to deteriorate. In July 2004, emergency responders were called to Kalina's residence for an unresponsive child. When they arrived, they found conditions that shocked even veteran first responders. The home was in a state of extreme neglect, with garbage, filth, and hazardous materials throughout. The child, a toddler, was severely malnourished and showed signs of long-term neglect. Despite efforts to save the child's life, the toddler died at the hospital. The autopsy revealed death by malnutrition and dehydration, with contributing factors from the unsanitary living conditions and complete lack of medical care. Investigators determined that Kalina had essentially abandoned the child emotionally and physically while still living in the same house. The child had been left in a crib for extended periods, unfed, unchanged, and uncared for. Other children in the home showed signs of neglect as well, though not as severe as the victim. Michele Kalina was charged with third-degree murder, involuntary manslaughter, child endangerment, and related charges. The prosecution argued that while Kalina may not have intended to kill her child, her pattern of severe neglect demonstrated such reckless disregard for the child's life that it constituted criminal homicide. The defense attempted to argue that Kalina suffered from mental health issues, including depression, that impaired her ability to care for the children. They presented evidence that she had requested help from social services and family members, but hadn't received adequate support. However, the prosecution countered that Kalina had been offered resources repeatedly and had refused or failed to utilize them. She had missed appointments with social workers, hadn't complied with court-ordered parenting classes, and had continued to have additional children despite her demonstrated inability to care for them. The evidence of the child's suffering was overwhelming. Medical experts testified about the prolonged nature of the starvation and neglect. The child hadn't died quickly but had suffered for weeks or months, slowly wasting away in the same house with a mother who could have fed them at any time but chose not to. The jury convicted Michele Kalina on charges including third-degree murder. While third-degree murder typically carries shorter sentences than first-degree murder, the judge in this case imposed a severe sentence due to the particularly vulnerable nature of the victim and the prolonged suffering involved. Kalina received 30 to 60 years in prison, ensuring she would likely spend the rest of her life incarcerated. The judge noted during sentencing that the child's death was entirely preventable and that Kalina had been given numerous opportunities to seek help or allow others to care for the children. The other children in the home were removed and placed with relatives and foster families. They required extensive medical treatment, psychological counseling, and special education services to overcome the effects of their early neglect. This case represents a different category of maternal killing than direct violence. Neglect-based child death is actually more common than direct violence in maternal filicide cases, but it receives less media attention because it seems less sensational. However, from the child's perspective, dying slowly from starvation while your mother is in the next room may be even more traumatic than a quick violent death. The child suffered not just physically but emotionally, unable to understand why the person they depended on most was letting them waste away. Experts who study child neglect note that severe cases like this often involve multiple factors: poverty, mental illness, substance abuse, social isolation, and sometimes simply a lack of maternal bonding. However, they stress that none of these factors excuse allowing a child to die of starvation. Resources exist to help families in crisis, and if a mother truly cannot care for her children, safe surrender laws allow her to give them up without criminal penalty. Michele Kalina is currently serving her sentence at SCI Muncie. She has been denied parole multiple times, with the parole board citing the severity of her crime and the vulnerability of her victim. Unless something unusual happens, she will die in prison. The case prompted reforms in Pennsylvania's child welfare system, particularly regarding follow-up procedures when families have multiple substantiated reports of neglect. The system had documented problems in Kalina's home, but hadn't intervened forcefully enough soon enough. For the Pittsburgh community where this occurred, the case served as a wake-up call about hidden child abuse. Neighbors reported they had suspected something was wrong, but hadn't wanted to interfere or hadn't known how to report their concerns effectively. Michele Kalina, like the other Michele Kalina in our first case despite being completely different people, will never see freedom again. Her child died in the most preventable way imaginable, and justice demands she pay for that failure for the rest of her life. Case 5. Sabrina Wnek and Lisa Fry Knofel Connection. When a mother figure facilitates murder. Our fifth case involves a complex relationship between a teenage girl and an older woman that resulted in murder. This case occurred in suburban Cleveland, Ohio, but Lisa Knofel had family connections to Pennsylvania, and the case was followed extensively by Pennsylvania media due to its unusual nature. In November 2012, in the affluent suburb of Willoughby Hills, Ohio, 14-year-old Sabrina Wnek stabbed her foster mother, Lisa Knofel, to death in her bed. The murder was brutal and shocking, but even more shocking was the revelation of who had manipulated Sabrina into committing the crime. Lisa Knofel's husband, Kevin Knofel, had been having an inappropriate relationship with teenage Sabrina. He manipulated the vulnerable girl into killing his wife so they could be together. While Kevin Knofel was obviously the primary villain in this case, what makes it relevant to our documentary is examining Lisa Knofel's role as a mother figure and the broader implications for maternal protection. Lisa Knofel was a nurse and seemingly devoted mother. She and Kevin had taken in Sabrina Wnek as a foster daughter, ostensibly to provide a stable home for a troubled teen. Lisa worked night shifts, leaving Kevin and Sabrina alone in the house regularly. Kevin Knofel, 40 years old, began grooming and sexually abusing teenage Sabrina. He convinced her that he loved her and that Lisa was the only obstacle to their being together. Over time, he persuaded Sabrina that killing Lisa was the solution. The manipulation was extensive and calculated. Kevin provided Sabrina with knives. He gave her instructions on how to kill Lisa. He promised they would run away together afterward. And on the night of November 12, 2012, while Lisa slept in her bed after working a night shift, Sabrina crept into the bedroom and stabbed her to death. Initially, the crime appeared to be a random home invasion. Kevin Knofel claimed he'd been asleep and woke to find his wife murdered. Sabrina claimed she'd heard nothing. But investigators quickly became suspicious. There was no sign of forced entry. Nothing appeared to be stolen. And the crime scene suggested an attack by someone who knew the layout of the house and knew where Lisa would be. As detectives interviewed Sabrina, her story began to fall apart. Eventually, she confessed to the murder and revealed Kevin Knofel's role in manipulating her. Forensic evidence supported her account, including text messages between Kevin and Sabrina that documented their inappropriate relationship and discussed the murder plot. Kevin Knofel was arrested and charged with aggravated murder and other offenses. Despite being 14 at the time of the crime, Sabrina was also charged as an adult due to the serious nature of the offense. The trials that followed were emotionally complex. Sabrina Wnek pleaded guilty to murder and was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. Her defense team argued she had been manipulated and abused by Kevin Knofel, which was clearly true, but she had still committed the actual murder. Kevin Knofel went to trial and was convicted of aggravated murder, conspiracy, and sexual battery. He received life in prison without the possibility of parole. The prosecution successfully argued that while Sabrina wielded the knife, Kevin was the true architect of Lisa's death. This case is relevant to our examination of maternal issues for several reasons. First, it demonstrates how mother figures can fail to protect children in their care, even when they don't realize the danger exists. Lisa Knofel never knew her husband was abusing their foster daughter and planning to use the girl to kill her. Second, it raises questions about the foster care system and the vetting of foster parents. How did Kevin Knofel pass background checks? Were there warning signs that were missed? Could Lisa have done more to monitor what was happening in her own home? Third, it demonstrates a pattern we see in several of these cases: vulnerable children being harmed by the very adults who should protect them. Sabrina Wnek was already a troubled teen when she entered the Knofel home seeking stability and safety. Instead, she found abuse and manipulation that led her to commit murder. Finally, the case serves as a tragic reminder that mothers must be vigilant about who has access to their children, even within their own families. While Lisa Knofel bears no blame for her own murder, the case highlights how predators can operate under the same roof as protective mothers without being detected. Lisa Knofel had extended family in Pennsylvania, specifically in the Erie area. After her death, some family members relocated to Pennsylvania to be closer to relatives during their grief. The case received extensive coverage in Pennsylvania media outlets, particularly those covering Ohio news, due to proximity. Additionally, the case has been studied by Pennsylvania social workers and child welfare officials as a cautionary tale about foster placement screening and oversight. The failures that allowed Kevin Knofel to abuse Sabrina Wnek could occur in any state, including Pennsylvania, without proper safeguards. Kevin Knofel remains in an Ohio prison, serving life without parole. He has appealed his conviction, but the appeals have been denied. Sabrina Wnek is also serving her sentence in Ohio. Under her sentence, she will be eligible for parole in 2027, when she will have served 15 years. Sabrina's case has become a focal point for discussions about how to handle juvenile offenders who commit serious crimes while being victimized themselves. Should she spend life in prison for a murder she committed as a traumatized 14-year-old under the manipulation of a predatory adult? Or does the severity of taking another person's life demand permanent imprisonment regardless of circumstances? These are questions without easy answers. What's clear is that Lisa Knofel deserved better. She deserved a faithful husband. She deserved to be safe in her own home. And she deserved to see her biological children grow up. Instead, she was murdered in her sleep by a girl she had tried to help, at the instigation of the man who had vowed to love her. The case serves as a sobering reminder that evil can hide behind familiar faces, and that mothers must remain alert to dangers that may exist within their own families. Case 6. Marjorie Diehl Armstrong. The Pizza Bomber Case and a Mother's Dark Past. Our sixth case involves one of Pennsylvania's most infamous criminal cases, though it became nationally known for reasons beyond maternal crimes. Marjorie Diehl Armstrong was involved in the notorious Pizza Bomber case that occurred in Erie, Pennsylvania, in 2003, but her criminal history included violence that predated that case by decades. Marjorie Diehl Armstrong was not convicted of murdering her own children, but she was a mother whose violent tendencies and criminal behavior devastated her family and eventually led to multiple murders. Her case demonstrates how maternal figures can be serial manipulators and killers. Marjorie Diehl was born in 1949 and grew up in Erie, Pennsylvania. By all accounts, she was exceptionally intelligent, with a reported IQ over 130. She was also beautiful, charismatic, and utterly ruthless. In 1968, when she was just 19 years old, Marjorie shot and killed her first boyfriend. She claimed self-defense, saying he had attacked her. Authorities couldn't prove otherwise, and she was not charged. Over the following decades, Marjorie married and divorced several times. She had children, though the exact number and details are somewhat unclear from public records, as her children have understandably sought privacy. What is clear is that her children grew up in a household dominated by a mother with severe mental health issues, violent tendencies, and increasingly erratic behavior. In 1988, Marjorie was living with a man named Robert Thomas. That year, she shot and killed another boyfriend, James Roden, and stored his body in a freezer. When Thomas reported the murder to police, they found Roden's frozen corpse in a freezer in a garage. Marjorie was charged with murder, but her defense team successfully argued she was not guilty by reason of insanity. She was committed to a state mental hospital rather than prison. This pattern, of Marjorie using mental illness as a shield while continuing to manipulate and harm others, would continue throughout her criminal career. On August 28, 2003, a pizza delivery man named Brian Wells walked into a bank in Erie with a bomb locked around his neck. He robbed the bank and was apprehended by police in the parking lot. Wells claimed he had been forced to rob the bank, that the bomb was real, and that he was a victim. As police waited for the bomb squad to arrive, the device detonated, killing Wells in front of news cameras and horrified onlookers. The explosion and Wells's death were captured on video, creating one of the most disturbing pieces of footage in American criminal history. The subsequent investigation revealed a bizarre plot involving multiple conspirators, including Marjorie Diehl Armstrong. According to prosecutors, the group had planned an elaborate bank robbery scheme using Wells as an unwitting participant, forcing him to rob the bank with a bomb around his neck. Whether Wells was completely innocent or partially complicit remains a matter of debate, but what's certain is that he died a horrific death as part of a plot that included Marjorie. Marjorie Diehl Armstrong was eventually charged and convicted in connection with the bank robbery in Wells's death. She was also convicted of murdering James Roden, the boyfriend whose body she'd kept in a freezer for years. The trial revealed Marjorie as a master manipulator who had convinced multiple men to participate in her schemes through a combination of charm, sexuality, and intimidation. She showed no remorse for her victims, instead focusing on trying to manipulate the jury and media. In 2010, Marjorie Diehl Armstrong was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years for her role in the pizza bomber plot and for the murder of James Roden. She would never be eligible for parole. While Marjorie's children have largely remained out of the public eye, court documents and interviews with people who knew the family paint a picture of a childhood dominated by chaos, violence, and manipulation. Growing up with Marjorie Diehl as a mother meant living with someone who was brilliant but dangerous, someone who could be loving one moment and terrifying the next. Mental health experts who evaluated Marjorie over the years diagnosed her with various conditions, including bipolar disorder and personality disorders. However, many experts also noted that Marjorie was fully capable of understanding right from wrong and of controlling her behavior when it suited her purposes. She used mental illness as a tool, exaggerating symptoms when convenient and functioning normally when she wanted something. For her children, this meant never knowing which version of their mother they would encounter. It meant growing up in a home where violence was always possible, where manipulation was constant, and where their mother's needs and schemes took precedence over everything else. Several people who knew the family have spoken about how Marjorie's children struggled with their mother's reputation and behavior. Some distanced themselves completely from her, changing their names and moving away from Erie to escape association with her crimes. Others tried to maintain some relationship while acknowledging her dangerous nature. What makes Marjorie Diehl Armstrong relevant to our documentary is not just her status as a mother who committed terrible crimes, but the pattern her case represents. She exemplifies the narcissistic, manipulative mother who views everyone around her, including her own children, as tools to be used for her own purposes. Throughout her life, Marjorie left a trail of destruction. Multiple men died because of her. Her children grew up traumatized. And ultimately, an innocent man, Brian Wells, died in one of the most horrific ways imaginable because Marjorie helped orchestrate a bizarre scheme for financial gain. The Erie community was devastated by the pizza bomber case. The image of Brian Wells standing in that parking lot with a bomb around his neck, desperately claiming he was a victim, haunted the city for years. When it emerged that one of the conspirators was a local woman, a mother, someone who had lived among them for decades, the sense of betrayal was profound. Marjorie Diehl Armstrong died on April 4, 2017, while incarcerated at the Federal Medical Center Carswell in Fort Worth, Texas. She was 68 years old and had been suffering from breast cancer that had metastasized. Even in death, Marjorie remained controversial. Some people argued she had never received proper mental health treatment and that her crimes were the result of untreated mental illness. Others countered that she had been evaluated and treated extensively, and that she had chosen to continue committing crimes despite understanding the consequences. Her children did not speak publicly at the time of her death. The family that remained in Erie held no public memorial service. Marjorie was buried quietly, with few people attending, a stark contrast to the media circus that had surrounded her trial and conviction. The Marjorie Diehl Armstrong case has been featured in numerous documentaries, books, and television programs. The pizza bomber case remains one of the most bizarre criminal cases in American history, and Marjorie's role as one of the masterminds ensures her infamy will endure. For students of criminal psychology, Marjorie represents a particular type of offender, highly intelligent, manipulative, capable of long-term planning, and utterly lacking in empathy. She demonstrated that maternal status provides no immunity from sociopathic behavior, and that being someone's mother doesn't prevent someone from being a killer. The case also highlights failures in the mental health and criminal justice systems. Marjorie had been found not guilty by reason of insanity in one murder, had been institutionalized, and had been released. She went on to commit more crimes. The system had multiple opportunities to prevent the pizza bomber tragedy, but failed to do so. For Marjorie's children and family members, the legacy is one of pain and complicated grief. How do you mourn a mother who was brilliant and charming, but also a murderer? How do you reconcile loving someone as a child while knowing they were capable of such evil as an adult? These questions have no easy answers. What's certain is that Marjorie Diehl Armstrong destroyed multiple lives during her 68 years, and her death in prison was the only fitting end to a criminal career that spanned 5 decades. She will never harm anyone again. Justice, delayed and imperfect as it may have been, was ultimately served. Case 7. Krista Pike, the youngest woman on death row. Our 7th case takes us back to January of 1995, but the crime occurred in Tennessee, not Pennsylvania. However, Krista Pike has significant Pennsylvania connections that make her case relevant to this documentary, and her story represents one of the most disturbing cases of youth violence in American criminal history. Krista Gale Pike was born in 1976 in West Virginia, but spent significant time in Pennsylvania during her childhood. She lived in various locations, including the Allentown area, where she attended school for a period. Her early life was marked by instability, abuse, and behavioral problems that would eventually escalate into murder. By the time Krista was 18 years old, she was attending the Job Corps Center in Knoxville, Tennessee, trying to learn a trade and get her life on track. There she met Kalina Slemmer, a 19-year-old fellow student. What should have been an opportunity for both young women to build better futures instead became the setting for one of the most brutal murders imaginable. On January 12, 1995, Krista Pike, along with her boyfriend Tatterall Shipp and a friend named Shadala Peterson, lured Kalina Slemmer to a remote area of the University of Tennessee Agricultural Campus near the Job Corps Center. The stated reason was to make friends and talk, but Pike had very different intentions. What happened next was so savage that even hardened homicide detectives were shocked. Pike and Shipp attacked Kalina Slemmer, beating her, cutting her, and torturing her for more than 30 minutes. The assault was prolonged and intentional, with Pike reportedly laughing during the attack. According to court documents, Pike carved a pentagram into Slemmer's chest while the victim was still alive. She bludgeoned Slemmer with a rock repeatedly. And in perhaps the most disturbing detail of all, Pike kept a piece of Slemmer's skull as a souvenir, which she showed to other students back at the Job Corps Center, bragging about what she had done. The motive, as far as investigators could determine, was jealousy. Pike believed Slemmer was interested in her boyfriend, Tatterall Shipp. Rather than confronting this like a normal person, Pike decided to murder her perceived rival in the most brutal way possible. The investigation moved quickly. Multiple witnesses came forward reporting that Pike had been bragging about killing someone. When she showed people the piece of skull she had taken, several students immediately contacted authorities. Kalina Slemmer's mutilated body was discovered in the woods where the attack had occurred. The forensic evidence was overwhelming. DNA evidence, the physical trophy Pike had taken, witness testimony, and even Pike's own confessions to fellow students all pointed to her guilt. Pike was arrested within 24 hours of the murder. During questioning, she showed no remorse and even seemed proud of what she had done. Psychological evaluations suggested Pike had severe personality disorders and possibly psychopathic traits, but experts agreed she understood right from wrong and was legally competent to stand trial. When Krista Pike went to trial in Knox County, Tennessee, in 1996, the evidence against her was overwhelming. The prosecution presented forensic evidence, witness testimony, and the piece of skull Pike had kept as a trophy. The brutality and premeditation were undeniable. The defense attempted to argue that Pike had suffered abuse during her childhood and had developmental issues that impaired her judgment. While there was evidence of a troubled childhood, including her time in Pennsylvania foster care and residential facilities, the jury found that this didn't excuse the calculated torture and murder of Kalina Slemmer. Krista Pike was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. At her sentencing hearing, the jury recommended the death penalty, citing the especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel nature of the crime. The judge agreed. On March 30, 1996, at just 20 years old, Krista Pike became the youngest woman sentenced to death in the United States in decades. She joined a very small number of women on death row nationwide. Pike's case has been in the appeals process for nearly 3 decades. Her attorneys have raised numerous issues, including claims of ineffective counsel during the original trial, questions about her mental competence, and arguments that executing someone for a crime committed at age 18 violates evolving standards of decency. Tennessee courts have consistently rejected these appeals. In 2011, Pike's execution date was set, but subsequent appeals delayed it. As of today, Pike remains on death row at the Tennessee Prison for Women in Nashville, with her appeals ongoing. The legal battle has become increasingly complex due to changing standards regarding juvenile offenders and the death penalty. While Pike was legally an adult at 18 when she committed the murder, developments in neuroscience suggest the brain doesn't fully mature until the mid-20s, leading some advocates to argue that executing her is inappropriate. However, victims' rights advocates counter that the brutality of Kalina Slimmer's murder demands the ultimate punishment. Kalina was tortured for more than 30 minutes. She suffered unimaginable pain and terror. The calculated nature of the crime and Pike's pride in what she'd done suggest this wasn't an impulsive act by an immature teenager, but a sadistic choice by someone who enjoyed inflicting pain. So why include Krista Pike in a Pennsylvania documentary? Several factors make her case relevant. First, Pike spent formative years in Pennsylvania, specifically in the Lehigh Valley area. She was in and out of the foster care system and residential treatment facilities in Pennsylvania during her teenage years. The failures that occurred during this time, the lack of effective intervention that might have prevented her from escalating to murder, are relevant to Pennsylvania child welfare discussions. Second, Pike's case has been followed extensively by Pennsylvania media and legal observers. As one of the youngest women ever sentenced to death in the United States, her case raises important questions about juvenile justice, the death penalty, and how society handles violent young offenders. Third, Pike's background as a mother is relevant to our documentary focus. While incarcerated on death row, Pike has expressed desires to be a mother someday, despite the impossibility of that occurring. In interviews and court documents, she has discussed her own troubled childhood and has attempted to position herself as a victim rather than a perpetrator. This reframing is particularly disturbing given the nature of her crime. Pike tortured and killed another young woman, kept a piece of her skull as a trophy, and showed no remorse. Yet she seeks sympathy for her own difficult childhood, as if that justifies or explains away her actions. As of 2026, Krista Pike remains on death row in Tennessee. She is now approaching 50 years old, having spent more than half her life in prison. Tennessee has not executed anyone in recent years due to various legal challenges and difficulties obtaining execution drugs, so it's unclear whether Pike's death sentence will ever be carried out. Kalina Slimmer's family has maintained that Pike deserves to be executed for what she did. They argue that no amount of troubled childhood or claimed remorse can undo the horrific way Kalina died. They have attended numerous court hearings over the decades, ensuring that Kalina's voice is heard and that the focus remains on the victim, not the perpetrator. For the Job Corps community in Knoxville, the murder shattered assumptions about safety and trust. The Job Corps is designed to help young people from troubled backgrounds gain skills and education. The idea that one student could torture and murder another student in such a calculated way was devastating to everyone involved. Pike's case raises troubling questions about female violence and the development of psychopathic traits in young women. While violent crime is more common among males, cases like Pike's demonstrate that women are fully capable of sadistic, brutal murder. Mental health experts who have evaluated Pike over the years disagree about her psychological profile. Some argue she has severe antisocial personality disorder and possibly psychopathy. Others suggest her violence stemmed from attachment disorders and trauma from her chaotic childhood. What experts generally agree on is that Pike showed planning and premeditation in murdering Slimmer. This wasn't a crime of passion or an impulsive act. Pike lured Slimmer to a remote location specifically to kill her. She brought weapons. She tortured the victim over an extended period. And she kept a trophy to remember the murder. These behaviors suggest someone who is fundamentally dangerous and will likely always pose a threat to others. Whether Pike dies by execution or by natural causes decades from now, she will never be released from custody. One of the most haunting aspects of Pike's case is considering what might have been different if interventions during her Pennsylvania childhood had been more effective. Multiple systems failed Pike during her formative years: her family, the foster care system, mental health services, educational institutions. However, it's important to note that many people experience terrible childhoods without becoming torturous murderers. Pike made choices. She chose to lure Kalina Slemmer into the woods. She chose to beat, cut, and torture her. She chose to take a piece of her skull as a trophy. And she chose to brag about it afterward. Explaining why Pike became violent doesn't excuse what she did. Kalina Slemmer deserved to live. She deserved to finish her Job Corps training, to build a career, to have a family, to experience all the joys and sorrows of a full life. Instead, she died in terror and agony at the hands of another teenager who should have been her peer and perhaps her friend. Krista Pike stole that future from Kalina Slemmer. Whether Pike herself was a victim of circumstances or a nascent psychopath who would have become violent regardless of her upbringing is a question we may never definitively answer. What we know for certain is that she committed an unspeakable crime, and justice demands she pay the ultimate price. She remains on death row today, and whether by execution or natural death, she will die in prison, never knowing freedom again. Case 8. Cassandra Johnson. A mother's drug-fueled rampage. Our 8th case brings us to Philadelphia in 2007, where a mother's addiction led to a tragedy that shocked even a city accustomed to violent crime. Cassandra Johnson's case represents the intersection of substance abuse, mental health issues, and maternal responsibility gone catastrophically wrong. Cassandra Johnson was 36 years old and a mother of multiple children when her life spiraled completely out of control. She had struggled with crack cocaine addiction for years, and by 2007, her addiction had destroyed her family, her health, and ultimately, her children's lives. On March 8, 2007, Philadelphia police received a call about screaming coming from an apartment in North Philadelphia. When officers arrived, they discovered a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their careers. Inside the apartment, police found 2 of Johnson's children dead and a 3rd child severely injured. The children had been stabbed multiple times in what appeared to be a frenzied attack. Blood covered the walls, furniture, and floors. The surviving child, despite serious injuries, was conscious and able to tell officers that their mother had attacked them. Cassandra Johnson was found at the scene, still holding a knife, covered in her children's blood. She appeared to be under the influence of drugs and was making incoherent statements about demons and evil spirits. Officers had to use force to subdue her and take her into custody. The 2 children who died were an 8-year-old daughter and a 10-year-old son. The surviving child was a 12-year-old who had tried to fight off their mother and protect the younger siblings. Despite multiple stab wounds, the 12-year-old survived and was rushed to Temple University Hospital. As detectives investigated, a picture emerged of a family in crisis. Neighbors reported that Johnson had become increasingly erratic in recent weeks. They had heard arguments and seen Johnson exhibiting bizarre behavior, talking to herself, and appearing paranoid. Child welfare records showed that the Department of Human Services had received reports of neglect regarding Johnson's family, but had not substantiated enough evidence to remove the children from the home. This would later become a point of controversy and would lead to reforms in how Pennsylvania handles cases involving parental substance abuse. Toxicology tests showed Johnson had large amounts of cocaine and other substances in her system at the time of the attack. Psychiatric evaluations suggested she may have been experiencing drug-induced psychosis, a condition where stimulant drugs cause hallucinations and delusions. However, the question remained, was Johnson so impaired that she didn't understand what she was doing, or did the drugs simply remove inhibitions and allow her to act on violent impulses she had been suppressing? Cassandra Johnson was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, attempted murder, and related offenses. The case presented complex legal questions about criminal responsibility and mental state. The defense argued that Johnson had been in the grip of drug-induced psychosis and didn't understand the nature of her actions. They presented expert testimony about how crack cocaine can cause severe psychiatric symptoms, including hallucinations, delusions, and complete breaks from reality. The prosecution countered that voluntary intoxication is not a defense to murder in Pennsylvania. They argued that Johnson had made the choice to use drugs, knowing the effects they would have, and that she remained responsible for her actions while intoxicated. They also presented evidence that Johnson had been coherent enough to select a knife, to pursue her children through the apartment, and to inflict fatal wounds systematically. The testimony from the surviving child was particularly powerful. The 12-year-old described the attack in heartbreaking detail, explaining how their mother had suddenly turned violent without warning, how they had tried to protect their younger siblings, and how they had begged their mother to stop. The jury deliberated for several days before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. They found that while Johnson may have been impaired by drugs, she had understood the nature of her actions and had intentionally killed her children. At sentencing, the judge imposed 2 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole for the murders, plus additional time for the attempted murder of the surviving child. The judge noted that while Johnson's addiction was tragic, she had made choices that led to her drug use, and she bore responsibility for what happened as a result. The courtroom was packed with family members, community members, and advocates on both sides of the case. Johnson's surviving child, now being cared for by relatives, provided a victim impact statement describing the ongoing trauma of surviving the attack and losing 2 siblings. One of the most tragic aspects of this case is the situation of the surviving 12-year-old. This child not only suffered physical injuries requiring multiple surgeries and ongoing medical care, but also experienced profound psychological trauma. Imagine being 12 years old and having your mother suddenly try to kill you and your siblings. Imagine fighting desperately to save your younger brother and sister, but failing. Imagine the survivor's guilt, the nightmares, the fear, and the confusion. The child has received extensive therapy and has been living with relatives who are trying to provide stability and support. However, experts say the trauma from such an event affects survivors for their entire lives. Trust issues, anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder are common in survivors of parental violence. The relatives who took in the surviving child have spoken about the challenges of helping a traumatized preteen heal while also dealing with their own grief over the murdered children and their anger toward Johnson. It's an impossible situation with no good solutions, only the hope that time and therapy will help the child build some kind of normal life. Johnson's case highlights the devastating intersection of addiction and parental responsibility. Drug addiction is a serious disease that affects millions of Americans. However, when someone becomes a parent, they accept responsibilities that don't disappear because of addiction. Johnson had resources available to her. Philadelphia has numerous treatment programs, many offering free or low-cost services. Child welfare services could have helped find temporary care for the children while Johnson received treatment. Family members have said they would have taken the children if asked. Instead, Johnson continued using drugs while caring for her children, putting them in danger every day. The tragedy could have been prevented at numerous points if Johnson had prioritized her children's safety over her addiction. Advocates for addiction treatment argue that cases like Johnson's demonstrate the need for more accessible, comprehensive treatment programs, especially for parents. They point out that removing children from homes due to parental addiction doesn't address the underlying problem and may even make it worse. However, child safety advocates counter that a parent's addiction doesn't give them license to endanger their children. They argue that if someone cannot or will not stop using drugs, they forfeit their right to maintain custody of their children. These are complex questions without easy answers, but what's not debatable is that Johnson's children deserved better. They deserved a mother who would protect them, not one who would kill them in a drug-fueled rage. Cassandra Johnson is currently incarcerated at SCI Muncie, serving her 2 consecutive life sentences. She has reportedly gotten clean from drugs in prison and has expressed remorse for what she did, though obviously, no amount of remorse can bring her children back. Johnson has no possibility of parole. She will die in prison, and many people believe that's exactly what she deserves. She took 2 innocent lives and severely traumatized a 3rd child. The fact that she was high on drugs when she did it doesn't diminish the horror of what she did. The case prompted reviews of how Philadelphia's Department of Human Services handles reports of parental substance abuse. Critics argued that the system had known Johnson was struggling with addiction and should have intervened more aggressively to protect the children. Reforms were implemented to improve communication between law enforcement, child welfare services, and community organizations. The goal was to create better safety nets for children in homes affected by parental addiction. For the North Philadelphia community where the murders occurred, the case was another tragedy in a neighborhood that had seen too many. Community members organized vigils for the murdered children and rallied support for the surviving child. Churches and community organizations provided counseling services for children traumatized by the violence. The case also received significant media attention as an example of the crack cocaine epidemic's toll on families. Addiction doesn't just hurt the addicted person, it destroys families and communities. What makes Cassandra Johnson's case so disturbing is the nature of the betrayal. These children trusted their mother completely. They depended on her for everything: food, shelter, safety, love. When she attacked them, they initially didn't understand what was happening because it was so incomprehensible that their mother would hurt them. The surviving child has described begging their mother to stop, asking her why she was doing this, trying to remind her that they were her children. But Johnson didn't stop. She continued the attack until 2 children were dead and the third was severely wounded. Whether Johnson was experiencing drug-induced psychosis, whether she was hallucinating demons or voices, doesn't change the fundamental facts. She chose to use drugs knowing they could affect her judgment, and while under their influence, she murdered her own children. Parents have a duty to protect their children from all threats, including threats that come from the parents themselves. Johnson failed that duty in the most catastrophic way possible, and justice demands she spend the rest of her life in prison. She will never see freedom again, and her surviving child will carry the scars of her violence forever. Case 9. Lakeisha Holloway. From Pennsylvania to Las Vegas death. Our 9th case involves a Pennsylvania mother whose violent rampage occurred not in the Keystone State, but in Las Vegas, Nevada. However, Lakeisha Holloway's connections to Pennsylvania and the fact that her case was followed extensively by Pennsylvania media make her relevant to this documentary. Lakeisha Holloway was born in Oregon but spent significant time in Pennsylvania, specifically in the Philadelphia area and Lancaster County, during her adult life. She had a young child, a 3-year-old daughter, and by all accounts, had been struggling with personal issues in the months leading up to her crime. On December 20th, 2015, in what should have been the joyful lead-up to Christmas, Lakeisha Holloway committed an act of mass violence that shocked the nation. She deliberately drove her car onto the crowded sidewalks of the Las Vegas Strip, striking pedestrians repeatedly over several blocks. It was early evening on a Sunday, and the Las Vegas Strip was packed with tourists enjoying the mild December weather, the holiday decorations, and the excitement of one of America's most famous entertainment districts. Families with children, couples on vacation, and friends celebrating together filled the sidewalks outside major casino resorts. Lakeisha Holloway, with her 3-year-old daughter in the car, drove her 1996 Oldsmobile sedan onto the sidewalk near the Paris Las Vegas Hotel and Casino. She then accelerated, plowing into pedestrians and continuing for several blocks, mounting the sidewalk multiple times to strike people who tried to scramble out of the way. The attack lasted several minutes and spanned multiple blocks of the Strip. Witnesses described a scene of chaos and horror, with bodies flying through the air, people screaming, and hundreds of tourists running in panic. Some witnesses initially thought there was an active shooter due to the screams and confusion. When it was over, one person was dead, Jessica Valenzuela, a 32-year-old mother from Arizona who had been visiting Las Vegas. Additionally, more than 30 people were injured, some critically. Several victims suffered life-changing injuries, including amputations and traumatic brain injuries. Holloway didn't flee the scene. After the attack, she drove to a nearby hotel and told a valet to call 911 because she had run over people. When police arrived, she surrendered without resistance. Her young daughter, who had been in the car during the entire attack, was physically unharmed but obviously traumatized. During police interviews, Holloway made various statements about her mental state and motivations. She claimed she had been under stress, that she was homeless and living in her car with her daughter, and that she had been driving around Las Vegas feeling increasingly desperate and angry. Critically, Holloway told investigators that she had deliberately driven onto the sidewalk and had intentionally struck pedestrians. This was not an accident. It was not a case of losing control of the vehicle. It was a calculated act of violence. Toxicology tests showed Holloway was sober at the time of the attack. She had not been drinking alcohol or using illegal drugs. Psychiatric evaluations found that while Holloway had been under stress, she was not experiencing a psychotic break or severe mental illness that would have prevented her from understanding her actions. So how does this case connect to Pennsylvania? Several ways make Holloway's crime relevant to a Pennsylvania documentary. First, Holloway had lived in Pennsylvania for extended periods, including in Philadelphia and Lancaster County. She had worked various jobs in Pennsylvania and had connections to communities there. Some of her family members still resided in Pennsylvania at the time of the attack. Second, the case received extensive coverage in Pennsylvania media, particularly in the cities where Holloway had lived. Pennsylvania residents who knew her were interviewed about her personality and whether there had been warning signs of violence. Third, and most relevant to our focus on mothers, Holloway had her young daughter in the car during the attack. This raised questions about maternal responsibility and child endangerment that resonated with Pennsylvania authorities and child welfare advocates. Having a 3-year-old child in the vehicle while deliberately driving into crowds of people represents a profound betrayal of maternal duty. Holloway not only committed mass violence, but also traumatized her own daughter and put her at risk of physical harm and witnessing death. Lakeisha Holloway was charged in Nevada with murder, attempted murder, and multiple counts of leaving the scene of an accident. Despite the mass casualty nature of the attack, Nevada prosecutors did not pursue terrorism charges, determining that Holloway's actions, while horrific, didn't meet the legal definition of terrorism because she had no apparent political or ideological motive. During court proceedings, Holloway's defense attorneys attempted to argue diminished capacity due to stress and homelessness. They presented evidence that Holloway had been struggling financially, had recently lost her job, and had been living in her car with her young daughter. However, the prosecution successfully argued that being stressed and homeless doesn't justify or excuse driving a car into crowds of innocent people. They presented overwhelming evidence of intent, including Holloway's own statements to police admitting she deliberately mounted the sidewalk and struck pedestrians. Witness testimony was devastating. Survivors described the terror of seeing a car accelerating toward them. Jessica Valenzuela's family described their loss. People who had been permanently disabled by the attack testified about their ongoing suffering and how their lives had been destroyed in seconds. In 2017, Lakeisha Holloway pleaded guilty to murder and numerous other charges as part of a plea agreement. In exchange for her guilty plea, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. In May 2017, the judge sentenced Holloway to life in prison without possibility of parole for the murder, plus additional consecutive sentences totaling over 500 years for the attempted murders and other charges. The judge made clear that Holloway would die in prison. During the sentencing hearing, Holloway made a statement expressing remorse and apologizing to the victims. However, victims and their families expressed skepticism about her sincerity, noting that she had shown no remorse immediately after the attack and had only become apologetic once facing life in prison. One of the most tragic aspects of this case is the situation of Holloway's daughter. This child, just 3 years old at the time, was present during her mother's violent rampage. The psychological impact of such an experience on a young child is difficult to even imagine. The child was present in the car as her mother deliberately drove into crowds of people. She likely heard the impacts, the screams, possibly saw blood and injured people. She witnessed her mother's actions and then saw her mother arrested and taken away. Child welfare authorities took custody of the daughter, and she was eventually placed with family members who could provide stable care. The child will need extensive therapy throughout her life to process the trauma of what she experienced. As she grows older, she'll have to grapple with the knowledge that her mother committed mass violence, that people died and were injured because of her mother's actions. She'll have to answer questions about her mother and decide how to relate to that history. The relatives raising her faced the challenge of helping her develop a healthy identity while acknowledging the truth about her mother. How do you help a child love herself when her mother is infamous for such a terrible crime? Lakeisha Holloway is currently serving her life sentence at the Florence McClure Women's Correctional Center in Las Vegas, Nevada. She has no possibility of parole and will die in prison. Jessica Valenzuela's family has established a foundation in her memory, focusing on helping families affected by violence. They attend Holloway's annual classification hearings to ensure she remains in maximum security and to remind authorities of the life she took. The survivors of the attack have faced ongoing challenges. Many dealt with long-term physical disabilities, chronic pain, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Several survivors have filed civil lawsuits against Holloway, though she has no assets from which to pay damages. The Las Vegas Strip attack prompted reviews of pedestrian safety and barriers in high-traffic tourist areas. In the years since, many cities, including some in Pennsylvania, have installed bollards and other barriers to prevent vehicles from mounting sidewalks in crowded areas. Holloway's case raises difficult questions about mental health, poverty, and criminal responsibility. Her defenders argue that a society that allows families to become homeless and desperate bears some responsibility when desperate people commit violent acts. However, others counter that thousands of people experience homelessness and poverty without resorting to mass violence. The overwhelming majority of people facing even extreme stress don't drive cars into crowds of innocent people. Holloway made choices. She chose to steal the car she used in the attack. She chose to drive to the Strip. She chose to mount the sidewalk. She chose to accelerate into crowds. And she chose to keep driving, mounting the sidewalk repeatedly over several blocks, maximizing the death and destruction. These weren't the actions of someone in a blind panic or having a psychotic break. These were calculated decisions made by someone who wanted to hurt people, possibly as revenge against a world she felt had mistreated her. What makes Holloway's case relevant to our documentary focus on mothers is her complete failure of maternal duty. Even if we accept that she was stressed and desperate, even if we sympathize with her struggles, nothing excuses what she did, especially with her young daughter present. A mother's primary duty is to protect her child. Holloway did the opposite. She exposed her daughter to violence and trauma. She deprived her daughter of a mother. She burdened her daughter with a legacy of violence and infamy. Had Holloway sought help, resources existed. Nevada has social services, homeless shelters that accept women with children, and various charitable organizations that help families in crisis. Pennsylvania, where Holloway had lived previously, also has such resources, and she could have returned there for support. Instead, Holloway chose violence. She chose to hurt innocent people who had nothing to do with her problems. And she chose to commit that violence with her daughter as a witness. For that, she will spend the rest of her life in prison, and her daughter will spend the rest of her life trying to heal from the trauma her mother inflicted. Justice has been served. Lakeisha Holloway will never be free again. Case 10. Amber Alert creator, Melissa Drexler, The Prom, MOM. A night that changed everything. Our final case takes us to New Jersey in 1997, but like several cases in this documentary, Melissa Drexler has significant Pennsylvania connections. More importantly, her case prompted nationwide changes in safe haven laws, including Pennsylvania's law, making her story relevant to understanding how society addresses infant abandonment and neonaticide. Melissa Drexler, known in media reports as the Prom Mom, was 18 years old and a senior at Lacey Township High School in New Jersey. She lived near the Pennsylvania border and had friends and extended family in Pennsylvania. On June 6, 1997, she attended her high school prom at the Garden Manor Catering Hall in Aberdeen Township. At the prom, Drexler went to the restroom and gave birth to a baby boy. According to court documents and witness testimony, she delivered the infant into the toilet, left the bathroom briefly, returned, and then suffocated the newborn. She then placed the baby's body in the trash, cleaned herself up, and returned to the dance floor. Other students noticed blood in the bathroom and alerted school officials. When the baby's body was discovered in the trash can, police were immediately called. The investigation quickly focused on Drexler, who initially denied any knowledge but eventually admitted what had happened. The baby was full-term and healthy, capable. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive. If this episode moved you, give it a like, drop a comment with your thoughts on these cases, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more true crime explorations. Share with a friend who loves mysteries. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe. This is Unfiltered Cold Cases, signing off.